There we go. Welcome, everybody. We'll give a few more seconds for people to get logged in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to the Animas Museum Second Saturday Series Seminar for July. My name is Susan Jones. I'm on the board of directors here at the Animas Museum and the La Plata County Historical Society. On July 1st, 1889, a hot and dry but very windy day, a fire broke out in Durango on what is now Main Avenue and 10th Street that destroyed a considerable amount of the relatively new city. The Harper's Weekly, a big magazine in those days, published a July 13th edition, so just barely 2 weeks later, that noted, and I quote, "This calamity may prove to be the best thing that could have occurred to make Durango's business blocks equal in size and appearance to those of Denver and Puebla." And they also said, again, I quote, "Durango has been of such recent origin that our people may have had no time in which to build business blocks entirely worthy of the city's commercial importance. Fire shaped our history, and the Great Fire of 1889 was no exception." So we're going to take an in-depth look at it today. With me is Charles D. Fernando, who will be telling that story. And if you love history and you don't know Charlie, well, you should. He's a fifth generation Durango native, Durango High School graduate, Fort Lewis College graduate, and was in at the beginning when Durango started thinking about preserving its history and starting a museum. He's the one that rebuilt the Joy Cabin on the museum grounds. And he was the lead narrator of the Durango and Silverton Railroad's onboard historical narration program. So if you come visit the museum, you can meet Charlie, since now he's in charge of our visitor service and a wonderful resource for all of us. Before I turn this over to Charlie, a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. We're using Zoom's webinar feature, of course, which means that you're all muted and your videos are all off. At the bottom of your screen, there should be a little set of icons, and you may need to mouse down a little bit to see them. There's one that says Q&A. If you have an immediate issue or question, please click on the Q&A icon and we'll be monitoring that throughout. We've disabled the chat function today to kind of minimize distractions, but use the Q&A. At the end of the talk, we'll open up for Q&A. You can either type them into the Q&A at any time and we'll answer them at the end, or at the end, you can click on the little hand and we'll allow you to unmute yourself and ask your question. This session is being recorded and you will receive an email in 24 hours with a link to the recording. With that, here's Charlie.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It's sure nice that we're getting some rain, and I bet back in 1889, they wish they had had some rain. But let's go to the first slide. We're going to talk a little bit about earlier Durango, before 1889, and this is a wonderful picture because this is very early in 1880. Actually, I think it's right on the cusp of 1881. But this is down at Main and what is now 9th Street. And over to the left, you can see a big pine tree there. That was known as the hanging tree. Behind it, you see the European Hotel, a 2-story building. That building was actually built on railroad right-of-way. So we can date how early this picture is by that structure still being there, because as the railroad grading crews approached Durango, that hotel had to be moved off of the right of way. And they actually moved it up 9th Street and up Main Street to a totally new location. Over on the right-hand side, you see a 2-story building there. That became the First National Bank of Durango. And behind it was a building that housed the post office and the Masonic Lodge. There's a 2-story building behind it. It was called the Luttrell Building, and it was actually built of brick and so forth. So I just want to, we're going to stay on that slide for just a moment. I found a very interesting clipping out of the Leadville Weekly Herald newspaper dated April the 30th, 1881. And it was a letter in the form of a letter to the editor, and it was titled Durango as It Is. And one of the paragraphs read as such: the town has now about 2,500 inhabitants, and the dry goods boxes, which have been erected here and called houses, will someday furnish as good food for the flames as did Deadwood and other of our mushroom mining towns. There are but 2 brick buildings now in the place, and many tents are and have been during all last winter doing duty as residences and stores. And it goes on to predict that Durango, from present indications, will take the place of Alamosa and act as an outfitting point for the San Juan. So even back here in April 1881, someone is predicting that Durango is going to burn. And it did. They didn't have to wait very long. In 1882, there was an announcement in the Mountain Mail paper that a recent fire at Durango destroyed 60 buildings and property estimated at $25,000. And another report, which was dated, the fire occurred on Friday afternoon, October 20th, 1882. And I'm just going to read the account of that fire. Fire at Durango. This is out of the Lake City Mining Register. On Friday afternoon, October 20th, a fire broke out in a small frame building and was not arrested until it had consumed 60 buildings. The firemen on hand had worked nobly, but there was an insufficient supply of water. The number of buildings destroyed was almost 60. Of these, the principals were the St. James Hotel on G Street, the Gem Theater, owned by J.I. Russell, and the building south of it, owned by Adams and Bailey. The residence of J.D. Shaw on the north side of H Street, and the St. Louis store, and also a large building owned by Mr. C.S. Tisdale on Railroad Street. The only insurance were $700 on the building owned by Adams and Bailey, and $250 insurance on Johnson's shoe store. The stock of Messrs. Goodman and Company, considerably damaged by paint or damaged by water, and was fully insured. They were in the paint and oil business. The total loss is variously estimated at from $15,000 to $30,000. Let's go to the next slide. Here's an early view of Durango, probably 1882. We can tell that by the absence of several buildings. In the view here, we're looking down from Reservoir Hill or College Hill to the east of downtown Durango. It's looking down on East 3rd Avenue or the Boulevard. Very noticeable over here on the right is the Presbyterian Church, which is at the corner of 12th and 3rd. And down at the opposite end of the block is the original Methodist Church at 11th and Third. But as you notice, Third Avenue has no median strip, but it is the widest street in the town. What else is very obvious in this picture is what was called the brick fire block, which is a little to the left of the center of the picture down on Main Street. You can see a two-story brick buildings with awnings down at street level. The railroad, when they sold the lots in Durango, required that the buildings in the fire block, that would be what is now the 800 block of Main, were to be masonry construction. So if a fire started on either side of that block, these buildings would act as a fire stop. So that's why they called it the fire block. Let's go, well, and what's also visible there just to the left of the fire of those brick buildings in the fire block is the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad's freight depot. It's a long, skinny building along the railroad tracks behind there. But as you can see, everything north of the fire block was mostly frame constructed buildings. There were only a few scattered brick buildings interspersed there with wooden construction. Let's go to the next slide. Here's some illustrations from a map of three of the churches. We have the Episcopal Church, which was originally built on 2nd Avenue in the 1000 block. St. Mark's Episcopal Church was the first denomination to get a church building up. Parson Hogue, who was the Episcopal minister, basically built the church himself. He was said to have carried the lumber on his back so that he could say that they had the first church in Durango. The Presbyterian and Methodist congregation quickly followed with more elaborate buildings, but they had lots on the boulevard or East 3rd Avenue. And of course, the Catholic Church was built up in North Durango across the river. And it also dates back to 1881. Let's go to the next slide. Here's a great view of early Durango taken from Smelter Mountain. You see the smelter down at the base of the photograph there in the river. And then across the river is the railroad roundhouse and the railroad depot and Main Avenue. You're looking right up Main Street towards Animas City, first North Durango, Brookside, and then Animas City. And if you look to the left of Main Street, you notice that there's a lot of vacant land between the railroad tracks and the river. And that is basically where that big fire in 1882 occurred. All of that land to the west of the railroad tracks to the river was reserved for railroad use. And so people who built over there were basically squatting on railroad property. And there wasn't the controls over there as far as building as there was in other parts of town. And so that makes sense that there was a major fire there because buildings were closer together and they were pretty shoddily built. Let's go to the next slide. Here is part of a Sanborn insurance map showing the fire block, and the Sanborn fire maps were coded with color. And if you saw either red, here it shows up sort of pink, but it's actually red on the original maps. And you also see blue. Blue indicated that the structure had stone masonry work. If it was red, that indicated that the building was constructed of brick masonry. So again, this is the fire block. On the west side of the street, most of the block was sort of filled in already with brick structures. And if you notice, on the back side, there were warehouses. That WH indicates that those were warehouses, and they lined up with the railroad yard. You can see railroad tracks. Those were railroad sidings indicated to the left there. And all of those warehouses had loading docks that were accessible to the railroad tracks. On the other side of Main Street, you see a brick building there also. That building, all of these buildings, well, not all of them, most of them still survive today. Part of the west side of the block was destroyed in the 1970s when we had the big fire downtown. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Here's an early photograph of the fire block. And again, these buildings pictured survived up until the 1970s downtown fire, which was caused by arson. But you can see those are pretty substantial buildings considering they were built clear back in 1881. Let's go to the next slide. Here is another illustration from a Sanborn insurance map, and this is before the fire, and this is at H Street and First. In the old days, H Street, they had letter designations for the streets, and Main Avenue was called First Street. Later on, they changed to the numerical system of streets and avenues. So H Street is now 10th Street, and First Street is Main Avenue. But this shows the 1000 block of Main Avenue. Over to the right, you see a variety theater. That's on the corner, occupied by Old Timers Restaurant, which was the Wall Drug Store. And across the street is where, what is that shop? It's a snowboarding shop and so forth. But if you notice here, all of the color designations are yellow, except for two structures in this block. The red and blue indicate stone and brick construction. The yellow indicates those are frame buildings. So almost everything north of 9th Street was originally in frame construction, wood construction. And several of these structures, you see very small brick structures. Those were bake ovens. There was either a bakery or a restaurant or a hotel that had a restaurant. And so they had an outdoor bake oven to bake in. So on that corner where Old Timers is, there's a variety theater there and two saloons. The variety theater was adult entertainment. That was not a theater for family participation. Let's go to the next slide. Here's a great photograph taken at that intersection, looking west towards Perrin. You can see Perrin's Peak in the background. The building on the left here it's called the Texas Exchange. That was also known as the Blum Building. The saloon was owned by a gentleman by the name of Blum. And on the other side of the street, on the northwest corner, was Ricker's fruit store. And behind Ricker's fruit store, there was a number of buildings down to the railroad tracks. And one of those was a restaurant. And that's where we think that the fire originated on July 1st of 1889. It never was totally 100% determined if that's where the fire started. There were a lot of stories circulating about this fire, but this picture is very interesting because here we have a wagon load of young ladies who were considered eligible brides to be. And there's a gentleman steadying the horse, and that gentleman is George Barnett, and he was Black. He was one of the early Black residents of Durango, and his son, Justin Barnett, lived in Durango until he passed away. Justin Barnett was a veteran of World War I. He fought in France and came back to Durango after World War I and lived here the rest of his life. We have an interesting oral history that was taken from Justin Barnett's sister a number of years ago, and I think we have that available, but let's go on to the next slide. Here's another view of Durango that's a little bit later. We believe that this overview picture is 1889, and it's obviously in the spring. There's still snow on Smelter Mountain, but again, at the lower right here, you see the Presbyterian Church, the original Presbyterian Church. Up on the next corner, you see the Methodist Church. And then behind them, in about the center of the picture, you see a very large rectangular building. That is what was the rink that was originally built as a roller skating rink. But when this picture was taken, it was the county courthouse, and it sat on the corner of 10th and 10th and East 2nd Avenue, where the current courthouse is located today. And to the right of it is another sort of long, skinny building, and that was the DAC, Durango Amateur Club building, which later became known as Reed's Opera House. And then a little ahead there in the picture, you see the fire block, the brick buildings down on Main Street. And way in the background behind them is the Graydon Flour Mill over by the river. But you can see that more houses have been built on 3rd Avenue by this time, but there's still no median strip down the center of 3rd Avenue. But you can see everything over here to the right is frame buildings. The churches were frame buildings. The courthouse building was frame, and they're very close together. Let's go to the next slide. Here is Durango's City Hall. And this building was located on 10th Street, where the current parking lot is behind the current City Hall. And this building housed the fire department, City Hall, and the public library. And there was a fire bell, of course, up in the tower. So if a fire got started in town, the alarm went out, the fire bell was rung, and that got everybody's attention. At that time, the fire department was volunteer, and that fire bell is what brought the volunteers to the firehouse to get the apparatus out to fight the fire. Let's leave that slide up for just a second. In the early days, Durango decided that they needed to buy a steam firefighting apparatus, a steam pumper. And so they bought one from the Silsby Company. Silsby was one of the major manufacturers of firefighting apparatus in the United States. And I came across a very interesting clipping out of the Great West, which was a Denver newspaper. And this is dated December 31st, 1881. And it says, Durango has bought a Silsby steam fire engine direct from the manufacturers, when Denver would have sold the town an engine of the same style much cheaper. So obviously Denver had some Silsbee pumpers that they were trying to get rid of, and they're mad at Durango for not purchasing one from them and going ahead and buying a new one. If you look at the old council minutes, there was quite a discussion about buying that pumping apparatus. And I suppose they decided it was money well spent to buy a new apparatus than buy something used and have it go bad. Let's go to the next slide. Here's a great picture showing the volunteer fire department, and it was made up of different companies that were stationed around Durango. And this picture was taken on 2nd Avenue in front of what is now the City Hall. And it shows the several different companies there. And the volunteers were organized in 1887. The picture says it was dated 1889, but there was a fire department before that. Again, the newspaper account of that 1882 fire, they talk about the fire department having trouble fighting that fire, and they claimed that it would have been much worse had there been wind, but that particular day there was no wind, and that is what helped them get that fire under control. Let's go to the next slide. This is a wonderful picture here. This picture was taken on Main Street in the 1100 block looking east. It was taken, it was near the intersection of 11th and Main, and over to the right, up in the upper right corner there, you notice a building, and in the window it says Sherman House. Sherman House was a hotel and restaurant, and there's a vacant lot in between. This is the location of the parking lot for Durango Craft Spirits today. This young gentleman on the borough, his name is Walter Boston, and his father was a photographer named Jacob Boston, and Jacob Boston's photo studio was opposite the Sherman House on Main Street. And so probably Jacob Boston took his camera out on the street to take this picture of his son, Walter. And it's a wonderful picture because if you look there at those wooden, all of those are wooden buildings. They're very close together. All of them were using wood and coal stoves to heat and cook with. And it's a miracle that they didn't have more fires than they actually did. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is the next block. This is the 1100 block of Main Avenue. So I Street would have been 11th Street, and this is going north. The Grand Central Livery was located up on the, it was on the southwest corner of 12th and Main. It's where Bank of Colorado is located today. Now you notice in this block, there were several buildings that are colored blue and one red building. So those blue structures were constructed of stone. The red building was brick and stone. But all of the other buildings, including the Sherman House down here on the lower center, were all frame construction buildings. And then up on 2nd Avenue there, again, there were houses up there that were frame structures. So this sort of gives you an idea of what will happen when a fire starts. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this is a picture looking south on Main from 12th Street. So over on the right, there's a two-story building there, which is the the Grand Central livery, and there's a buggy out in front. And then down in the middle of the block, there's a building with a hardware sign. That was the W.C. Chapman hardware company. And across the street from the Grand Central livery is a brick building that has a sign that says tin shop and secondhand store. That building survived the fire. That is the old model tire store that's at the corner of 12th and Main. It's now a gym, a health club gym. But again, this is looking down Main Street, and as you can see, this is before the fire. All of those buildings are wood construction. There's several two-story hotels, etc. And you see the smoke in the distance, which is belching out of the New York and San Juan smelter. But the other interesting thing about this picture, over here to the left, along the front of the buildings, you see power lines. And Durango, and you also see an arc light hanging out from one of those power poles there to illuminate the street. A lot of people don't know it, but Durango incorporated an electric company in 1885, and by 1887, most of Durango was electrified. Now let's go to the next slide. This is another picture of the Grand Central livery. This picture, again, it's taken at 12th and Main. You see the boardwalk, sidewalks there. We see some activity there at the livery stable. We got horses and carriages, and we're looking west over towards the Hogback and Perrins Peak. Let's go to the next slide. This is the Durango Herald newspaper from Saturday, July 6th, 1889. So the fire occurs on July the 1st. The Durango Herald was not in the path of the fire, so they were able to publish a paper on July the 6th. And this paper contains the account of the fire. And if you notice up there in the upper right on the newspaper, this copy of this paper belonged to a Mr. Boyle. Boyle was a very important businessman in Durango. They had actually started out in Animas City. Let's go to the next slide. This is a handwritten account of a child's perspective of the fire. This was written by Helen Boston Searcy on July the 31st of 1939. And she's doing this from memory. Someone asked her about her recollections of the Great Fire, and she was just a young child. She was visiting her friend Stella Russell, who lived up in North Durango across the bridge up near St. Columba Church in that neighborhood. And in this recollection, she says that she and her friend Stella were playing in the Russells' front yard, and it was about midday, and they heard the fire bell ring. And that immediately got their attention because they knew what that fire bell signaled. And so they ran from the Russells' yard to the edge of the hill, looking over the Animas River towards town. And they could tell there was a fire. And even though they knew their mothers would not approve, they then proceeded down the hill and across the bridge, and they went as far as the railroad tracks at 14th Street. And when they got to that point, they stopped because they knew with the amount of smoke that was billowing that they had not better go any further. So anyway, this is a fascinating account, and you have to remember, she recalled all of this when she was fairly elderly. Let's go to the next slide. So this is a photograph showing the area that burned. And of course, there's a notation there on the photograph, Durango after the big fire. Now, this is not immediately after the fire. This is probably a few days after, because up there a little right of the center, you can see that somebody has already pitched a tent. And in the center of the picture, up in the center there, there is the remains of a brick building. That was the one brick building that was in that block. And again, this is the 1000 block. So down here on the right, you see 10th Street, and over to the left, you would see 11th Street, and then beyond that, 12th Street. And you're looking up towards the mesa and the boulevard. So everything is destroyed from the railroad tracks all the way up to the east side of the boulevard. And it's a little hard to tell, but if you look straight up 10th Street, you see a large two-story building. That's Longfellow School. That was the first school in Durango, and unfortunately, it eventually burned down. But over here on the south side of 10th Street, you notice that there's still a building standing. That is the Blum Saloon, or what was known as the Texas Exchange. In the early accounts of the fire, they say that that building was catching fire numerous times, but the fire department really worked hard to keep that building from burning so that the fire would not continue south. They were aided by the wind, because the wind was coming from the southwest and blowing northeasterly. The fire started, they believe, in a restaurant behind Ricker's Fruit Store, which was on the corner of 10th and Main. And the reason that the fire department had such a problem is that the previous Saturday night, there was a fire that had burned the Reed Opera House, or what was also known as the Durango Amateur Club building on 2nd Avenue. And so the fire department had all of the fire hoses laid out on the street to dry out so that they could re-roll them. And so this fire burned so quickly that the fire department could not get the hose strung. The hoses burned where they laid on the street because they couldn't get to them. That's how hot the fire was. I'm going to read just some accounts. It's interesting when you, this was such a big deal that this fire made newspapers all over the state of Colorado. And what I'm going to read here is actually from the Aspen Weekly. It was published on July the 8th of 1892. And again, the fire occurred mid-afternoon on July 1st of 1889. And this article is titled Durango Losses. Durango, July 3rd. Opinions differ as to the origin of the fire of Monday afternoon, sweeping away nearly all of 8 blocks between H and K streets and from Railroad Street to the Boulevard, including 1st and 2nd. Many expressed strong doubts of it having an incendiary origin. The wind was blowing hurricane-like, and the hose was all stretched out on the sidewalk on H Street to dry, having been used at the fire of the DAC Hall or Reed's Opera House on the Saturday night previous. Durango was never before caught in such an unguarded position. the city hall getting fired so soon after the fire started in Wagner's restaurant, it made it impossible to get enough hose and other apparatus for extinguishing the fire that, aided by the wind, the whole burned district seemed to be aflame at once. This is the second great fire Durango has had since the town was started in the fall of 1880, when several blocks were burned between the railroad and the river. But the loss by the former fire in the fall of 1882 was not more than 1/4 as great. The first great fire would have swept a great portion of the city away, as there was then a strong wind, if there had been a strong wind, had the fire department and its apparatus been in such a plight as last Monday. It is thought the city will not be kept under martial law longer than tomorrow. Very little of value remains in the ruins, though they have been under guard. Nearly 100 men have been pressed into martial service since Monday night. People feared that there was a fire bug that started these fires, and there was even a newspaper account that somebody witnessed someone throwing lamp oil on the steps of the Presbyterian church and igniting it before the fire ever got up there. That was never proved. The vaults containing the county records stood the great heat, and records are all in excellent condition. And there's a great story about that. One of the county clerks, when he heard the fire bell, immediately started putting all of the records into the vault. And he was drinking a beer at the time, and he put his bottle of beer on the shelf in the vault. And the next day, after things cooled down and they opened the vaults to check on the records, they said that his beer was still cold. So the vaults worked pretty good. It says, those who have sufficient means are already getting ready to rebuild with brick as soon as possible. Numerous communications asking if aid is required have been received, but it is thought that it will not be necessary to accept any. A home relief committee has already secured about $1,500, which is being paid out to those who are in absolute need. About 150 families are homeless, and it is estimated that nearly 200 sufferers need aid, which will be supplied at home as long as those who escaped can support the fund. Following is a condensed report of the losses appearing in the Denver Republican this morning, which does not include a number of losses of from $50 to $500. So in other words, this list is only losses greater than $500. And I'm not going to read them all, but I've just highlighted a few. The courthouse was valued at $7,000, and they had insurance of $500. There was a Chinese gentleman by the name of King Chung who lost his laundry, and he also had a small store, and he lost his entire supply of tea and Japanese goods valued at $800. He had no insurance. Isaac Cherry, who had a brick building, he was in the harness and saddle business. His building was insured for $2,000. Well, he had a loss of $2,000. He had insurance for $1,700, so he was better insured. H.M. Copeland was a commission merchant. He only lost $200. Dr. Griffith owned a two-story residence worth $1,500. I don't think he was insured. O.F. Boyle owned a saloon and two other buildings. His loss was $4,000 with a $1,200 of insurance. The Presbyterian Church was estimated at valued at $5,000 with insurance of $4,000. Wilder's photo gallery they put a claim in of $700. The Idea newspaper which was up the street on 10th, on the corner of 10th and 2nd, they lost their printing presses and their whole building. They were insured at $3,000. The Clipper Theater, which was on the location of Old Timers, they valued their loss at $7,500 with insurance of $2,000. And that business was owned by Charles Newman, a very reputable local businessman who eventually built the Newman block down at the corner of 8th and Main Street. He also lost his house on the boulevard, which was valued at $750. The Grand Central Hotel, which occupied the east side of Main Avenue at the corner of 11th and Main, was valued at $20,000. They were only insured for $8,000. The City Hall and other city buildings had $3,000 insurance. They never even got the steam pumper out of the firehouse before it burnt to the ground. And also destroyed in the City Hall, that was the location of the public library. They valued their book collection at $3,000. So the City Hall was valued at $6,000, and they also lost 1,000 feet of hose. The Sherman House, which we showed in that earlier picture, it was valued at $7,000. They had no insurance. Henry Strader lost his home up on the boulevard. It was valued at $1,500. He only had $700 insurance. J.A. Boston, another photographer who took that picture of the young gent on the burro, he valued his loss at $3,000 and had no insurance. H.R. Ricker, who had the fruit store, his building was valued at $3,000. He had insurance of $1,000. And the fire started right behind him in a restaurant. Another hotel, the American House, it was valued at $3,000. It had no insurance. The Methodist Church and its parsonage was valued at $8,000. They had insurance of $2,300. The Episcopal Church had a loss of $3,000, no insurance. So anyway, and of course the W.C. Chapman hardware business, they lost a hardware stock of valued at $25,000, and they had insurance for half of that. So there's all kinds of different accounts from different newspapers from all over the state, and everyone has a little bit different take on the fire. But most people at the end believed that the fire did originate in that restaurant, that there weren't any fire bugs, but there were fires, a whole string of fires starting clear back in April leading up to this fire that were suspicious. Several houses of ill repute in the red light district were burned to the ground. There was another theater, a variety theater in the red light district that burned to the ground. All of them had a suspicious nature. Let's move to the next slide. This is the illustration that was used in the Harper's Weekly article that appeared on July the 13th of 1889. And of course, this engraving was taken from one of those earlier photographs that I showed you. And of course, this shows Durango before the fire. But of course, this was in the time before they had photographic reproductions in publications. They used engravings from photographs. So let's move to the next slide. So here is a Sanborn insurance map after the fire. This is dated, I believe, 1893. But this again shows the 1000 block of Main and up on and Second Avenue, the 1000 block of Second Avenue. And one of the first people to recover from the fire was the Idea newspaper. There was an article that was published on August the 17th of 1889, and it mentions that, I'll just read this small citation. The grit and determination of the proprietors of the Durango Idea, which was completely destroyed in the recent Durango fire, is a credit to the newspaper fraternity, and to the proprietors of the Idea are bound to succeed as they deserve. While the senior partner has rustled up a job press and is back and at work at the old stand, in other words, they're publishing again, Mr. Butler is now east arranging to take in a complete new printing outfit and bring it to Durango and start all anew. And again, they were located up on the corner of 10th and 2nd. I think in this picture, I'm not sure where they relocated to, but in this Sanborn map, again, it's after, it's 1893. You see that there's a new county courthouse up at 10th and East 2nd. That courthouse was constructed in 1891. But down on Main Street, again, on the northwest corner of 10th and Main there, you see Ricker's. Ricker was one of the first to rebuild his store. In the newspaper accounts, new construction was started on his building as soon as the ashes cooled. There was a newspaper account that said Ricker had the foundations in, a basement dug, stone foundations were being laid. They were starting to lay brick walls above on the main level. And this was in mid-August of 1889. In his original proposal to the city, he was building in brick, but his storefront was going to be wood. And the city stopped his construction and required that he put an iron storefront on his building. And if you look at that building today, the original iron storefront is still on the south side of the building on 10th. It's where the skateboard and snowboard shop is at 10th and Main. It's also known as the Gem Theater building. That's something different that comes later. But you can see there, all of the buildings that have been reconstructed are mostly brick, but there is one restaurant that is constructed. It's blue, it's constructed of stone. And those buildings still survive today. Let's go to the next slide. This is the next block north. This is between 11th and 12th. And you can see there again, new buildings were built. The farthest building north on the right side survived the fire. That's the old model tire store. But directly next to it is Durango Livery. Their original wood building burned in the fire and they rebuilt in brick. And again, in this map, they indicate that one of the buildings is currently being built. And across the street from it there is the new Chapman Hardware building. It's a combination of brick and stone. And then behind it is a large warehouse, which is stone. And those buildings still exist today. They are just north of the Ernie's Station, whatever they call there where all the food trucks are on the corner of 11th and Main. And again, you can see the Grand Central Stables up at 12th and Main. Next slide, please. Here is the new Chapman Hardware building that was pictured in that previous map there. That building still stands today. And I think there's a real estate office there or something now. But you can see right adjoining it, he's got a wooden shed that he sold his farm implements and wagons from. Now, let's just keep that slide up for a moment. Now, I mentioned when this fire started, there was a big effort made to keep the fire from going south into the Texas Exchange or the Blum building. Well, eventually on May the 28th of 1891, the Blum building burns to the ground, taking with it several buildings adjoining it. So again, that 900 block of Main, which was also known as the Saloon block, was still wooden buildings after 1891. So again, in 1891, fire starts at the north end of that block and it consumes about half of the block. The newspaper clipping says, flames at Durango, May the 28th. Fire starting between 3 and 4 o'clock this morning in the saloon of J.C. Sutherland, spread rapidly and consumed a number of buildings on both sides of the street. Following is a list of losses and insurance. MP Blum lost $6,000, insurance $2,000. Hellman Boyle building lost $4,000, insurance $1,750. J.C. Sutherland and Company lost $1,000 in dollars, insurance $2,600. So actually $4,000 loss, insurance of $2,600. E. Reinsberg, a loss of $4,800, insurance of $2,500. Boston Photographer. So here, Boston opens a new location. His business burns again with a loss of $1,000, insurance not known. Frank Young, saddle maker, lost $5,000, insurance $500. N.W. Savage lost $500, fully insured. The block in which the fire occurred is composed entirely of frame buildings, 7 of which are saloons. Then that still leaves half a block of frame buildings in the 900 block. So then on July the 14th, the following year, 1892, a fire broke out in a fruit store next door to the First National Bank. That first slide we looked at today was at 9th and Main, showing the First National Bank building. And next to it was a fruit store. A fire started in it, and a saloon was next to that. And within moments, the bank was a total loss. And here's what the newspaper account says. Durango, July 14th. Early this morning, a fire broke out in the fruit store occupied by B.F. Gillen next door to the First National Bank. The bank, a 2-story building, was soon enveloped in fire, and the building occupied by Dick and Wokey Saloon was also attacked. In spite of hard work, the flames gained and totally consuming the buildings occupied as the fruit store and making a wreck of the First National Bank building and Dick and Woteek's Saloon. The vault containing the money and bank records was not injured in the slightest degree. The total loss will be in the amount of around $10,000. So then the First National Bank had to relocate across the street in the 900 block in temporary quarters until they could build a new structure, which again was built in brick and stone, and again still occupies that corner at 9th and Main. Let's go to the next slide. Here's our last slide of the day. This is a view of Durango after 1892. Again, this is taken from up on Reservoir Hill or College Mesa, whatever you want to call it, looking down on 4th Avenue, 3rd Avenue, and the town. You can see the smelter stacks belching away clear down there in the south end of town. You can see that the boulevard has now got median strips. There's probably some little skinny sticks of trees there, but they don't show up in the photograph. But you can see that there is grass planted in those median strips. What's also very obvious in the picture, we have the new courthouse building a little to the right of center in the picture. And down here at the bottom right of center, you see the new high school building, which was built again in about 1892. It's on what is now known as the Mason School property. And over to the left of it is 4th Avenue. That school building was at 12th and 4th. And over to the left there was a small building, which was the German Lutheran Church. So my time is up. Does anybody have any questions?
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
Well, no, it was time. And I was finished.
That was amazing. If you have questions, go ahead and type them in the Q&A or raise your hand and we'll let you unmute. So I know I've heard this story and told this story a million times, but just seeing the juxtaposition of the pictures and the Sanborn maps just really makes it come alive. That's just amazing. And I do want to say that if it was hard to see the Sanborn maps on the Zoom screen, we are putting links to them. You can get them from the Library of Congress and download very detailed TIFFs, if you want, of those Sanborn maps that for us are an absolutely incredible resource as we're trying to keep La Plata County and Durango history alive. So I'm not seeing any questions. If you do have questions, give us a call here at the museum or send us an email at info@animusmuseum.org. Before we go, I want to give some shameless self-promotion. Museum is open Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays from 10 a.m. until 4 p.m. and on Wednesdays from 1 p.m. until 7 p.m. So come by. We have some evening hours now, so you can come in after work. There's no charge for admission, so even if you have only a few minutes, come see our newest mini exhibit commemorating the 20th anniversary of the Missionary Ridge Fire, featuring the artworks of local artist Mary Ellen Long. We just got news that the wonderful historic bed and breakfast, the Gable House, will be holding an ice cream social and garden party on Sunday, July 31st at 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. featuring cream bean ice cream and all supporting the Animas Museum. So drop by, they're at 805 East 5th Street, and we'll have more information on our website. August 6th, we're going to have a quilt open house, quilt day open house here at the museum. We'll have some quilts from the collections out as well as white cotton gloves, so you can get a chance to examine these wonderful artifacts up close, and quilt historian Patricia Joy will be on hand to answer questions. The next second Saturday seminar series will be on August 13th, where we're going to do a virtual tour of the Animas City Cemetery. And there's a lot more, including, and in what was kind of interesting in this picture, we talked a lot about photographers without really having to deep dive in the photographers. But now, because of this fire, you can almost certainly realize why so many photographs of early Durango are gone, because we lost so many photography studios. But as Kathy Gibson is saying, thanks Kathy, some of those photos were produced by Goner and Lika, and we're going to talk more about all the photographers, Mr. Boston, Mr. Wilder, Mr. Goner, on our seminar series in October. So stay tuned on our website. If you don't get our newsletter, become a member and we'll send you a newsletter, or watch for our e-blasts. If you want to continue to see this type of programming in the future, become a member, and remember there's a little donate button on the bottom of every page on our website. We really appreciate all your donations and support. So with that, thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you.